Matt, thanks for joining us this week. Thanks for agreeing to pinch hit for Congressman LaTourette.
Happy to be here.
Been a busy week.
It
Obviously,
has.
the president submitted his annual budget to Congress, and kind of wanted to jump into that today and talk a little bit about what was in there,
Sure.
kind of the odds on some of this stuff ever becoming reality, and kind of what some of the fallout is going to be. Let's jump right to it. Let's start with transportation. There was a lot of stuff about transportation in the president's budget. Talk to us a little bit about what was in there, what's likely to happen, what's not
Sure.
going to happen.
So, kind of starting off with that, a budget really is just two things. One is its projection estimates of what revenue and spending will be for the coming year, and then the policies that'll get you to those estimates. And so one of the big things that the president proposed is really reemphasizing, infrastructure and transportation. And he proposed a $478 billion investment into roads, bridges, ports. And certainly for a lot of sectors of the country, that's a really good thing. That's over 6 years, by the way. And, we got to look at the fact that the Highway Trust Fund expires sometimes this summer, and we need to reauthorize that, get that going for the foreseeable future. Our infrastructure is graded as a D+, and that's just not reflective of how we are as a country. So, he does a lot of good things. He puts good things from certain perspectives. But Tiger grants, this is a very broad category of, a boost of infrastructure funding.
So what's the Tiger? Just
Tiger Grant
Tiger Grant, yeah, for those who don't know.
A very versatile grant program that the Department of Transportation undertakes that goes to pretty much everything under the department. So it could be aviation, it could be rail, it could be transit. And so he more than doubles that program. He puts a lot into a new infrastructure bank, which is a way for cities, counties, states to access capital for major infrastructure projects through the private sector, which ultimately would be self-sufficient. Excuse me. And so, but to do this huge bill, he's chosen not to raise gas taxes, which for drivers and most Americans, that's great. Better bridges, better roads without raising the gas tax. So how are you going to pay for this? And he does that by going after something called repatriation. And so right now, all foreign earnings by U.S. companies, there's about $2 trillion in foreign earnings abroad that's just sitting because the tax rate to bring that back to the U.S., to their shareholders, is about 35%. So they'd rather just keep it abroad, invest in their foreign operations. It's good for them abroad, but it's not good for our shareholders here in the U.S. It's not good for local investment and domestic efforts. And so they're just going to keep it out there. Well, the president has proposed to give them an option. You could either bring it back at a 14% tax rate, which is a lot better than 35, or I'm going to tax that $2 trillion that you have abroad at 19%. And he thinks that that's a good way to actually incentivize them to bring that money back, and the revenue collected will then go back into our own infrastructure.
So a couple of follow-ups on that.
Sure.
One, I think it's interesting at a time when the gas tax is kind of getting some bipartisan buzz on the Hill, particularly as we have incredibly low gas prices, that the gas tax is not something that the president is proposing, and particularly because the gas tax is a kind of guaranteed stream of revenue going forward as opposed to repatriation, which is much more of a kind of a stopgap measure here. Talk to us about why you think the president hasn't decided to go the route of the gas tax, but instead the repatriation route.
Well, it's never been an easy thing to do, at least in the past 20 years, to propose the gas tax. And so, I think that he bet on the fact that it would be more politically palatable to basically put the cost of infrastructure improvements on large corporations over your pocketbook. And so it's certainly not a guarantee for funding, which we traditionally have through the gas tax, which we pay at the pump every time we go. And instead we're getting this kind of new stream, which is not a guaranteed stream of funding, but it is something that could work. And I think it's really a political calculation that he thinks it's more politically palatable. We'll have to wait and see if it is.
And the second thing on repatriation I wanted to ask you about is this is something that has actually garnered some bipartisan support. Senators Rand Paul and Barbara Boxer, like the ultimate political odd couple,
right,
have put together their own bill. What I thought was interesting was that the president's approach was a higher number taxation rate than the Paul Boxer bill. And I just wonder how much you think repatriation is really going to be in the mix. We've heard some kind of mixed signals from folks in both the House and Senate about how much repatriation is in the mix. How much at the end of the day do you think that it's going to be in the mix when we're talking about funding for transportation?
I will tell you this. This issue of repatriation has really been a roller coaster ride over the past 10 years, and at times you think that it's close to getting passed. What you need to watch for is what the Congressional Budget Office, which is the nonpartisan accountants who actually look at a proposal and say whether it's going to bring in additional revenue to the government or cost more money. It's interesting to watch what they do on this bill, because that's really going to be the key. Because in years past, we thought we were going to have the bill done, except they ended up scoring the bill as being revenue negative, which means it would actually cost the government money over the course of that legislation. That's what ultimately derailed it. So watch the CBO, and I think that'll be a good indication of where things go.
Well, another one of the interesting pay-fors in the president's budget was something that I don't think a whole lot of folks were talking about beforehand. Was talking about an actual increase in the capital gains tax for wealthy Americans. There's been a lot of kind of bipartisan push over the last few years to actually cut the capital gains tax rate. So I was, for one, a little surprised about this. Two questions. One, what do you think the rationale is there? And two, does this have any legs whatsoever in a Republican-controlled Congress?
I'll answer the second part first, which is no.
Because that's easier. Yeah.
The answer is no. Traditionally, Republicans have been very skeptical about raising the capital gains tax, and but to the first part, it's roughly expected to be about a $200 billion boost to the federal coffers to increase the capital gains. What he's proposing, by the way, is raising it from 24 to 28% for the top bracket of earners, which is over $500,000. So it's a targeted capital gains increase, but the target rarely makes a difference when it comes to Republicans, who generally like to take a more principled approach toward capital gains, which is that they say, in principle, anytime you tax capital gains, you're actually restricting investment and growth. So I tend to think that it's not going to pass. But why he did it, I think that he had to get his budget deficit as low as possible. He's compared to where it was, 5 years ago, it's about a third of what it was back then. But in order to do that, you really do have to find mechanisms to actually reduce that deficit. So he's proposing the capital gains as a way to really bring that down significantly.
Well, this conversation is kind of a good intro into the last piece I want to talk about. We've talked about some of the pay-fors here, and one of the reasons why the president has to have these pay-fors is because he's talking in very strong words about ending the sequestration level spending here on Capitol Hill, which, again, I thought it was a really interesting shift. The last few years of kind of talking about the runaway deficits and debt and our need to kind of get spending under control, the president came out very, very strongly in his budget for ending that and returning to an increased funding across the board almost. Again, two parts.
Right.
One, odds that this is going to happen in a Republican-controlled Congress, and two, how does he square this with the kind of the sentiment, the deficit debt control sentiment that's out there?
It's hard to say. I would start out with, we've lived under the sequestration, which is automatic across the board. Every program gets an equal reduction percentage-wise. And that's not very good for the administration. They really like to prioritize. They like to be very selective in which programs get more funding than others, but sequestration is a blunt tool that was always meant to be a stick to warn both Congress and the administration about reducing spending. So ultimately, it did work for the past few years. We've implemented it and been consistent with that original budget agreement from 2 years ago. Looking forward, though, the president has indicated that it served its purpose, but at the time, it was about reducing the deficit, which at the time was really a concern. As we have record GDP right now, record revenues coming in, the emphasis on deficit reduction has become less of a concern for the administration, and economic growth and really extending the good streak we're on with regards to GDP and employment. That's now his priority.
So, and the second question there, what are the odds of this going anywhere in a Republican-controlled Congress? What are the odds you think the House or Senate is going to come back with numbers that mirror the president's on overall spending?
I think you're going to see some Republicans who will feel out, send a little trial balloon to see what type of message he might get if he or she might be somewhat receptive to the idea. But ultimately, I think that it's not going to happen. But you might see a couple of Republicans in the House and Senate support the idea as being a way to, kind of boost the economy in their states and districts.
Excellent. Well, it's something we'll keep a close eye in the weeks and months ahead. Matt Henkin, thanks for joining us this week.
Thanks.